Hello, and welcome to the OSBA Get On Board video series. My name is John Price, and I'm the staff attorney here in the legal division at OSBA. This video will cover campaign contributions and expenditures. But before we get into the materials, I do want to point out our legal hotline phone number here on this slide. If you have any questions about the materials in any of these videos or about board campaigns generally, feel free to give us a call on our legal hotline at 1-855-OSBA-LAW. So just a few things, a few general rules for contributions and expenditures that I want to get into before we get in more detail. So the key thing to remember is you need to be keeping track of all contributions and expenditures. You also need to create a campaign committee and have a campaign treasurer if you're going to accept any contributions and or make expenditures. Some of these rules may not apply if you are self-funding, not accepting contributions, and or not spending money on anything outside of filing fees. So first, let's talk about contributions. So a contribution is defined in Ohio law, and I wanted to highlight the statutory definition for you here because it's pretty broad. It goes beyond just writing a check, which is what most of us think of just in day-to-day thought when we think about the word contribution, but it's defined as a loan, gift, deposit, forgiveness of indebtedness, donation, advance payment, or transfer of funds, or anything of value that is made, received, or used for the purposes of influencing the results of an election. So I've highlighted the word anything of value here. That's going to be important later on, but that's that's a broad phrase. So there are a lot of things that could potentially constitute contributions, which would trigger some of these rules that do not look like just someone writing a check to you. And I just want to make sure you're keeping that in mind. But before we talk more about the nature of contributions themselves, let's talk about appropriate contributors. There are rules governing who can legally make contributions to a campaign here in Ohio. Appropriate contributors includes most any U.S. citizen age 7 and up. A quirk in the law is you're not permitted to accept donations from children 6 and younger. And there are some, otherwise eligible citizens who may not be eligible to make contributions, but I'm not going to get into all of that here. But this does include, or the appropriate contributors does include the candidate themselves. So if you are running and want to donate some of your own money to your campaign, you can absolutely do that. Just remember that once you make that contribution, that money becomes the property of the campaign and all of those rules apply. It ceases being your money at that point. That also includes political action committees or PACs or political contributing entities, PCEs, political parties, other campaign committees can make contributions to a campaign, and also so can public employees. However, I've highlighted that in yellow here because there are some special rules that you need to keep in mind. So you as a candidate are prohibited from soliciting contributions from public employees that you will have immediate supervisory control over, and that makes sense when you think about it. So just keep that restriction in mind. So some non-lawful contributors include anonymous contributors. So we're not allowed to do that. We need to be able to identify the source of any contribution. The law also actually puts an affirmative obligation on your campaign if you do receive an anonymous contribution to try to locate who that person is so that it can be disclosed. Minor children under 7, already talked about that a little bit. Corporations, nonprofits, and labor unions are also prohibited from contributing directly to a campaign. However, they may contribute and work through these other entities such as PACs or PCEs. And you're also prohibited from taking contributions from foreign nationals or foreign states directly, meaning states outside the United States. So just some general rules about contributions. So there is no dollar limit on contributions generally here in Ohio, except there is a $100 limit on the amount of what I will say cold hard cash that you can accept from any one person. So that means like dollar bills, coins, what we think of when we think of cash. You can't accept more than $100 of that from an individual. In-kind contributions, this goes back to the thing of value that I was talking about earlier. So this can include things like someone who might donate an item or office space to your campaign or even a discount. So those are things that have market value. that are not necessarily writing a check. So those do constitute contributions that need to be tracked and disclosed and reported appropriately. So keep that in mind. Fundraiser contributions, so you are permitted to have fundraisers and solicit contributions in that way. And when those are reported, those can be reported generally in the aggregate. However, you do need to be keeping an itemized list of who makes these contributions at any fundraisers that you might have. Another category of items that I just want to flag for you are what we would call non-contributions. So these are things that actually aren't contributions. And this can include stuff like services provided by volunteers, ordinary home hospitality, personal expenses of a volunteer paid for by the volunteer, and things of that nature. So these are things that actually are not contribution. So now that we've covered contributions, let's talk a little bit about expenditures. So expenditures generally must be made for one of four purposes. Those include influencing the results of an election, a campaign expense, the candidate's duties as a public officer, or even making a charitable contribution. So any money that's going out as an expenditure from your campaign needs to fall under one of those purposes. The main question that you can ask to make a determination as to whether or not an expenditure is appropriate is, but for the fact that he or she, meaning the individual running, is a candidate or office holder, would they be making this expenditure? If the answer is no, then the expense is allowable as a campaign expenditure. If the answer is yes, they would be making that expenditure regardless of their status as a candidate or office holder, then the expenditure is not appropriate. So there is also a general question of reasonableness when it comes to campaign expenditures. Any expenditure that your campaign makes needs to be reasonable in both type and amount. So this goes to not only what your campaign is spending money on, but how much are you spending? So some general examples of reasonable campaign expenditures includes things like yard signs. We see those a lot. Consultants, campaign consultants are appropriate expenditures. Mileage to another district on a fact-finding mission, that's an appropriate expenditure. Office supplies and computers. However, one thing that you need to keep in mind when it comes to things like office supplies, computers, things like that, those need to be used for the purposes of campaigning and influencing the results of an election. You should not be purchasing a computer that you end up basically using to plan a vacation and claiming that as a campaign expense. That is not appropriate. Make sure you're using it for that appropriate purpose. I want to talk a little bit about disclaimers. So disclaimers are things that are messages that must appear on anything that is created in an attempt to influence an election. And if a disclaimer is required, then you need to use this exact verbatim line that I have here on the slide, paid for, and then the name of your candidate's campaign committee. So any sort of ad that you're running, maybe on television, online ads, things that you might put in the newspaper, have to include this disclaimer. So make sure that any sort of materials that are going out that are campaign materials, using it to influence the results of the election, needs to include this exact language, unless they fall under one of these exemptions. So there are certain items that the law exempts from the disclaimer requirement, and a lot of them include things like what we might consider knickknacks. That's not a technical term, but things like frisbees, magnets of a certain size. There's actually size dimensions listed in the statute or rule if you're interested. Things like badges or buttons, balloons, caps, hats, cups and mugs, pens and pencils, and t-shirts. These are some items that are exempt. There is a more thorough list that is actually included in the rule. So there actually is also an exemption for individual posts on social media. So things like Facebook status updates and tweets do not have to include the disclaimer, as long as the campaign committee has a homepage on the site that properly identifies the committee. Note that other online communications, such as emails, do require the disclaimer. So, I talked about Facebook statuses and updates, but I also earlier talked about email and other electronic ads earlier. Those emails and electronic ads do need to contain the the disclaimer that I talked about. It's just individual kind of Facebook status updates or tweets. You don't have to include that on everything. I'm sorry, you don't have to include the disclaimer on each of those individually. And I think earlier I mentioned that these items that are exempt are listed in the statute. It's actually a rule in the administrative code. So that kind of wraps up the kind of general nuts and bolts of campaign expenditures and contributions. Here are some additional resources that I would encourage you to look at if you need more information. Lastly, here is my contact information. If you have any questions about any of these materials, be happy to talk to you about it. But other than that, thank you so much for your time and attention here today, and have a good rest of your day.